So for the, I would like to, before the presentation begins, I would like to inform you how the presentation will be going on. So first, I will invite the speakers one by one to presenting their paper for about 5 until 10 minutes. Then during the presentation, if the participants have a question related to the presentation, they may ask in the chat room, or if you want to address your question directly to the speakers, you may raise your hand using the raise hand feature. And then after all the speakers presenting their paper, and if we have sufficient time, you will have the opportunity to ask them directly. Okay, so let us start the presentation by having the first speaker, Ms. Akansa Singh. Okay, so my PGR here is Ibu Hairani Amalia. Okay, Ms. Akansa Singh, have you share your PowerPoint to the committee?
Yes, I've already submitted it.
Okay. Okay, okay, thank you, Pak Taufik. So you may start your presentation now, Ms. Akansa. The room is yours.
So hello everyone. My name is Akansha. I'm a PhD scholar at Ashoka University, India. So the topic of my presentation is alignment, breaking or negotiating in case of Afghan communities in early modern South Asia. So we see that in early modern South Asia, the Afghans shared a fraught relationship with the Mughal Empire. Several Afghan groups resisted Mughal authority, while some also allied with the empire. In this context, my paper sort of investigates the. Can you please change the slide? So in this context, my paper investigates the utility of the concept of fitna in helping us make sense of complex history, and it focuses on the actions of the Afghans in relation to the Mughal wars directed against them between 1585, which sort of marked the Mughal annexation of Kabul and the beginning of Akbar's campaigns against the Afghans of Afghanistan, and 1600 Khaja Usman, an important Afghan Zamindar, sort of defeated by the Mughal forces in Sylhet in eastern Bengal. And the paper is based on two literary texts, Abul Fazl's Akbarnama, which is a detailed biographical account of the reign of Mughal Emperor Akbar, and the second is Mirza Nathan's Baharistan-e-Gaibi, which is a source on the history of the Mughal campaigns in eastern India during the early 17th century. And this paper is particularly divided into two sections. In the first section, I focus on the Afghans in Afghanistan, and the second section focuses on the Afghans in Bengal. So I begin by focusing on how historians have actually used this category of fitna so far. And in South Asian historiography, the concept of fitna was sort of first introduced by Andre Wing in the mid-1980s, mainly through his writing on the Maratha state formation in the 18th century. And Wink argues that the Marathas sort of ruled and expanded by exploiting rivalries, making use of factions, and aligning with local leaders. He says that the Marathas built up their rule by incorporating disorder, at least adapting to the reciprocity of order and disorder, and uses the term fitna to sort of describe this conflict and contention where alliances was very fluid and very ever-changing. Next, Durkheim sort of analyzes, in his analysis of the historical evolution of the military labor market of Hindustan in 1991, adopted this concept of fitna to argue that these groups of soldiers sort of navigated the various polities of medieval South Asia through constant negotiations, alliance switching, and brokerage. And according to him, the concept of fitna sort of helps us, make sense of this fluid military culture. And more recently, in 2002, George Commands has explained fitna as a permanent tendency of sedition, rebellion, and the manipulation of ever-crumbling alliances. And he describes how the Mughals and Marathas used large armies primarily for political display to demonstrate the ruler's wealth and power. This was, meant to attract potential allies and integrate them into their imperial formations. So against the backdrop of this scholarship, I sort of explored the actions of various Afghan groups in Afghanistan and Eastern Bengal in the late 16th and early 17th century. And the conclusion of this paper, I will return to reflect on how, helpful this concept of fitna is in interpreting the political actions of these Afghans. So I'll start with actions of Afghans in Afghanistan. The period immediately following 1585 is of key political and administrative transitions in modern Afghanistan. In military and political affairs, the Afghans and Mughals were engaged in constant conflicts in the region. The Mughal armies faced strong opposition and repeated revolts from the Afghan groups. And we encountered some Afghan tribal groups who sort of accepted the Mughal authority at first, but whenever they got the chance, they sort of escaped from imperial services. And one such case is of the Yusufzai tribesmen who dominated the Swat and the Bajar areas, and these were the most numerous and powerful of Eastern Afghan tribes. There are also cases where Afghans belonging to one of the tribes sort of collaborated with the Mughal armies against another Afghan tribal group. And one such case is of the Orakzais, who, please take it to the previous slide, the Afghans, yeah, collaborated with the Mughal armies against another Afghan tribal group. And one such cases of the Orakzais who sort of aligned themselves with the Mughals against the Yusufzais to, prevent the latter from plundering caravans which were operating between Kabul and Hindustan. So interestingly, the Yusufzais were not only in constant conflict with their fellow Afghan groups, but also, resisted the Mughal expansion in the Afghan region in the late 16th century. The Mughals therefore wanted to, crush them, and Akbar subdued these turbulent tribesmen by imposing a strict blockade against them. And the Akbarnama also mentions Afghan tribes like Afridis, Panis, Orakzais, Ahmaks, Baluchis, and Suris seeking alliances with Mughal imperial officials as well as local leaders. And one such example is of the Afghans belonging to the Afridis, Panis, Suri tribes who in 1602 sort of joined Ahadad Dad, who was an Afghan chieftain, and in his dispute against the Mughal army at a place called Pira on the Khyber Range. So we also notice examples where the Afghan tribesmen sort of joined Mughal Empire soon after hostilities ensued. And the Afridi tribesmen were one such amongst the others who sort of submitted to the Takhta Beg, a Mughal imperial official. So we see that military resistance by Afghan tribes in Afghanistan was a source of great concern to the Mughal state since the late 16th century and through the 17th century. And in many cases, Afghan tribes also fought each other, creating law and order problems for the Mughal Empire. And on the other occasions, certain Afghan groups sort of also choose to, ally with the Mughal Empire, although in many cases, these alliances we see it sort of broke down. Please, next slide. Yeah, actions of Afghans in Bengal. So, in their decisive campaigns in eastern Bengal between 1608 and 1612, the Mughal army sort of fought a group of formidable Afghan chieftains who had settled in the region some time back. And there are numerous instances from the region of Bengal where the Afghan chieftains sort of aligned with the invading armies, invading Mughal armies in the first stage itself, and then they were eventually co-opted into the empire. Thus, when Pir Muhammad Lodi, who was an Afghan, informed Ihtimam Khan, a Mughal commander, about the activities of other Afghans and death of an Afghan named Darya Khan, he, along with his brothers, was sort of, allowed to join the service of the Mughal commander. And in a lot of cases, Afghan chiefs sort of also aligned with the Hindu Bengali Zamindars to resist the Mughal armies in Bengal. And the Afghan chieftain Musa Khan sort of joined the hands with Madhav Ray of Khalsi, Vinod Ray of Chandrapratap, and Pehelwan of Matang. In many cases, we also find that the Afghan groups sort of supported various other groups, Afghans, Bengali, and Mughal defectors, in sort of resisting the Mughal armies. And then there are also cases of some Afghans who were, building up and breaking of alliances. For them, building up and breaking of alliances was very frequent. And Musa Khan, a prominent Afghan chieftain, is a case in point. So when hostilities began, Musa Khan sort of submitted to the imperial army and decided to come to terms with the Subadar of province and other imperial officers. However, following this, we find him, rebelling repeatedly as often as the circumstances were in his favor. So overall, we see that Afghans in Bengal were repeatedly engaged in the task of alliance building and alliance breaking. And during this period, a good many Afghan chieftains also choose to resist Mughal expansion, while others also form alliances of varying duration. It was also crucial for the Afghans in Bengal to sort of negotiate with the other local Muslim and non-Muslim chieftains. Can you please change the slide? Please take it to the conclusion. Yeah. So with this, I just conclude my paper. So we see that in both the sections, a common thread that sort of runs across is that, the Afghan chieftains and groups, they made continuous attempts to prevent the Mughals from consolidating their position in the regions in question. And if we sort of come back to views of the three Dutch historians that I discussed earlier, Venkov and Gomans, on the idea of fitna, interestingly, I think it is possible locate a subtle difference in which the Afghan groups sort of operated during this particular period in resisting the Mughal authority. So in this case of Bengal, we see that some of the Afghan chieftains carefully avoided engaging in large conflicts with the Mughals. In contrast, the Afghan groups in Afghanistan fought relentlessly with the empire. Hence, in Afghanistan, it was more about violent clashes and protected warfare. In Bengal, we find a more fluid process involving, resistance, elimination, and co-option. And one could sort of argue that the Afghans demonstrated greater political strength as a collective in Afghanistan. And let us now return to the question we began with. Does the concept of fitna sort of helps us to make sense of the actions of the Afghans under focus? I would argue that contrary to the Marathas, the behavior of the the concept of fitna falls short in explaining the behavior of Afghan groups. To some extent, we find them forging and switching alliances both with the empire and with other political groups, both in Bengal and Afghanistan. However, the nature of Afghan political behavior is far more complex than just being, based on this politics of shifting alliances. And their absorption into the empire was as much a matter of building, shifting, and breaking of alliances as of violent clashes and lengthy periods of military violence. So the way Venkov and Gomans have defined fitna as a category does not have the flexibility to accommodate this history of rampant warfare within its definition. Therefore, I think it seems a little difficult to, draw together the various activities and the actions of Afghans in both the regions under the notion of fitna. And I personally think that the complex actions of the Afghans need to be, understood in their own terms. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Sakan Sashing. It is a very interesting topics to talk. It's about whether they align breaking or negotiating in Afghan communities. It is a very interesting. So then, if the participants have a question, please you can type it down in the chat room. If you want to address your question to Ms. Sakan Sashing. And for the next speakers, I would like to invite Mr. Dr. Nur Rois SH MH.
Okay, thank you.
So
can I share my own screen?
Yes, you can share your screen.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
My name is Nur Rois, and I like to present my article about debating the science of jurisprudence, studying jurisprudence from the philosophy of science perspective. Okay. It seems and with connection.
So maybe we'll go to the next speakers, yeah, while we are waiting for Mr. Rois. So let's have dari from Sulawesi Utara. Is that right? Okay. So okay, can you share can the committee share the presentation slide? Okay.
Oke, boleh mulai ya kan Ibu Dian?
Okay, we'll wait for a second.
Oke,
Okay.
thank you. Oke, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I would like to say thank you for coming to my presentation. It's great to see you all. Let me introduce myself and my partner. I am Erli Wulandari Muiz, and my partner are Indra Rahayu Setiawati Togala and Husni Halim. We are from National Family Planning Coordinating Board Southeast Sulawesi Provinsi. First, I asked permission to use Bahasa Indonesia, and I didn't turn on the video because I am in remote area. Oke, Danatang, Naluri Alam dan Penguatan Pendidikan Maritim Anak Suku Bajo. Mohon next slide. Oke, next slide, Mbak. Next slide, Mbak. Maaf. Slide selanjutnya kayaknya belum kelihatan nih. Iya, makasih. Oke, sebenarnya sejak usia dini, anak suku Bajo sudah memperoleh pendidikan maritim oleh orang tuanya. Seperti anak langsung dimandikan dengan di awal ini kemudian di
Okay, we cannot hear you, Bu Irli. Kita tidak bisa dengar. Mungkin karena jaringan mungkin ya.
Sepertinya jaringannya, Ibu.
Oke, Bu Irli keluar juga.
Dia keluar juga.
Oke, sepertinya Bu Irli juga keluar. Ya, yeah, what happens with the connection today?
Iya.
Oke, ada sudah ada Bu Irli.
Halo, Assalamualaikum.
Ada.
Ya.
Apa sudah bisa tersambung? Oke.
Ya, silakan Bu Irli, silakan lanjutkan.
Ya, mohon maaf, saya lanjut ya. Iya. Bagi masih di introduction tadi, kami ingin menjelaskan sebenarnya bagi orang Bajo kebiasaan melakukan pendidikan maritim merupakan salah satu dari budaya mereka yang berlangsung secara terus-menerus dari generasi ke generasi, yang bertujuan agar sejak masih bayi anak diperkenalkan lebih awal identitas asli dirinya sebagai orang laut. Setelah anak mulai besar, pendidikan informal maritim masih tetap berlangsung, namun bentuk pendidikannya sudah berbeda. Kemudian pendidikan yang diberikan pada anak berdasarkan pengalaman sehari-hari orang tua secara turun-temurun yang memang pekerjaan orang tuanya sebagai nelayan. Dan kesemuanya ini terangkum dalam tradisi budaya yang kami sebut yang disebut oleh suku Bajo adalah danakang. Danakang yaitu bentuk intervensi pendidikan budaya bahari atau kelautan bagi anak-anak suku Bajo melalui pendidikan informal yang bentuknya melalui penyampaian nilai-nilai budaya dan kepercayaan, termasuk bercerita yang secara terus menerus diturunkan kepada anak-anak dengan melibatkan dalam kegiatan orang tuanya sebagai nelayan. Next, untuk metodologi untuk mengeksplorasi dan mendeskripsikan pemahaman tua dan di desa Sulawesi Tenggara. Yang kami gunakan adalah metode non-probabilitas, yaitu purposive sampling untuk rekrut.
What is your voice, please?
Yeah, no voice. We cannot hear you, Bu Iroi.
Halo, Assalamualaikum.
Oke, silakan lanjut, Bu.
Iya, Bu Dian, maaf. Beberapa kali terlempar.
Yeah,
Baik,
it's
saya
okay.
masuk saja langsung ke hasil dan pembahasan yang di benar yang di slide ini. Kami ingin menjelaskan anak suku Bajo sebenarnya mereka mulai mengenal laut melalui beberapa tahap. Di antaranya ketika anak usia 5 sampai 8 tahun, mereka hanya sekedar diperkenalkan oleh orang tuanya dengan cara anak melihat aktivitas yang dilakukan oleh orang tuanya, seperti pada saat mempersiapkan peralatan ketika akan melaut dan memperkenalkan jenis alat tangkap. Kemudian ketika usianya sudah 9 tahun ke atas, mereka dianggap sudah remaja yang sudah layak membantu pekerjaan orang tuanya di laut. Pada tahap ini, anak selain telah memahami dan mengetahui berbagai hal yang telah diajarkan, seperti adat ketika turun melaut, mengenai ramalan cuaca buruk, kemudian langsung mempraktekkannya dalam aktivitas keseharian sebagai anak yang orang tuanya bekerja sebagai nelayan. Nah, ada beberapa hal yang terkait dengan pendidikan mengenal laut atau danakang bagi anak suku Bajo yang diajarkan oleh orang tuanya, diantaranya yang pertama mengenalkan dan mengajarkan tentang, kedua mengajarkan tentang keberadaan dia bagaimana perahu dan bagaimana teknis tangkap ikan. Seluruh kegiatan tersebut dia melakukan pada anak penceritaan terus menerus dan ketika aktivitas melaut. Next slide-nya. Baik, terima kasih. Pengetahuan tentang keadaan komputer diperoleh
Bu.
ya. Dian. Halo, Pak Niki.
Iya, sudah
Iya,
jelas.
udah.
Oke,
Terima
silakan.
kasih. Iya, saya lanjut di slide selanjutnya. Ya, terima kasih. pengetahuan tentang keadaan ombak di lautan sebenarnya ini diperoleh anak dari mereka masih kecil pada saat mengikuti ayahnya melaut, sehingga pada saat dewasa dan mereka telah berkeluarga, pengetahuan tersebut dijadikan pedoman dalam aktivitas melaut sebagai nelayan. Keadaan ombak dan musim ditandai dengan berbagai hal, itu salah satu pengetahuan yang diberikan oleh orang tuanya. Nah, ombak besar ini kalau menurut orang tuanya biasanya akan muncul pada saat musim barat, yaitu sekitar bulan Januari hingga Juli. Puncaknya itu di bulan Januari dan Maret. Musim tenggara berlangsung dari bulan Juli hingga Desember, dan pada saat itu ombak relatif tenang. Jadi kalau bulan ini sudah agak aman kalau untuk melaut. Sekalipun ombak terjadi pada musim barat, namun pada saat itu ikan paling banyak ditemukan. Dan pada musim barat, ikan-ikan telah selesai bertelur sehingga ikan akan mengapung ke permukaan laut. Sebaliknya pada saat musim tenggara, air laut akan relatif tenang dan ikan-ikan akan turun ke dasar laut. Dan ini bukan waktu yang tepat untuk mereka memenuhi perekonomiannya. Ketika mereka melaut dan melihat laut tidak berombak dan air laut tidak berarus deras dan banyak buih air yang khas, maka dapat dipastikan bahwa di nelayan selanjutnya Mbak, perubahan musim ditandai oleh laut yang berbeda yang dibawa oleh hembus angin. Apabila angin maka pada malam hari kelihatan permukaan laut seperti nyala dan bergerak. Kemudian orang tuanya kemudian menjelaskan tentang bahaya yang akan mereka dapatkan apabila mereka tahu ingin stabil, sehingga kegiatan sehari-hari anak suku Bajo secara tidak langsung sebenarnya diisi dengan belajar kelautan yang tadi diajarkan penjelasan melalui praktek. Ya, halo Mbak.
Ya, we can hear you, Bu.
Saya lanjut Mbak. Ini udah masuk, iya. Barangkali di slide selanjutnya. Iya. Ya. Iya, halo.
Silahkan Bu.
Ya, slide selanjutnya Mbak, yang di bagian apa ya ini?
Belum berubah, Pak Taufik. Ya.
Tentang kondisi angin dan cuaca. Ya, terima kasih. Bukan yang di Koya, yang selanjutnya setelah slide. Iya. Baik, untuk slide selanjutnya tentang kondisi angin dan cuaca. Belum berubah. Oke, terima kasih. Untuk saya lanjut yang terkait dengan kondisi angin dan cuaca, kegiatan sehari-hari anak suku Bajo sebenarnya secara tidak langsung itu diisi dengan belajar tradisi maritim yang diajarkan melalui penceritaan.
Hilang lagi Bu Irli.
Ibu Erli kurang ini, jaringannya kurang stabil. Bu Sardian. Ini, iya.
Iya. Ya, baru ada lagi.
Ya, silakan Bu Erli.
Ya, baik. Lanjut Mbak Dian.
Ya, go ahead.
Iya.
Ya, silahkan Bu.
Iya, mohon maaf. Mohon maaf. Iya, mohon maaf ya. Iya, tinggal beberapa slide. Ya, beberapa slide lagi. Tinggal paling hanya 2-3 slide. Baik, ya. Ke slide selanjutnya, yang tentang yang paling kedua itu terkait dengan bagaimana memperbaiki mesin perahu yang. Oke, terima kasih. Dalam membuat perahu, yang harus diperhatikan adalah penggunaan bahan kayu yang berkelas dan atau yang berkualitas baik.
Halo Bu Erli.
Sepertinya terlempar keluar lagi Bu
Iya.
Lili.
Iya, baik.
Bu Erli.
Mohon
Silakan
maaf. Iya,
dipersingkat
betul.
saja Bu.
Iya,
Bu
silakan.
Irlin.
Langsung ke
Mungkin-
conclusion.
mungkin- iya, silakan.
Conclusion
Baik,
saja.
baik.
Kesimpulan, conclusion. Oke, di kesimpulan, temuan kami memberikan wawasan tentang jenis gaya dan praktek pendidikan informal keluarga yang lazim dilakukan di masa lalu, dan meskipun anak tidak dididik secara formal, karena kita tahu suku Bajo itu sangat rendah partisipasi pendidikan formalnya. Temuan kami juga mengungkapkan bahwa anak-anak suku Bajo itu mereka sangat menyukai praktek dan kepercayaan budaya Danakang yang diwariskan orang tuanya, dan mereka ingin mewariskannya kepada anak-anak mereka serta generasi yang akan datang. Thank you so much for your attention. Terima kasih banyak Mbak Dian, terima kasih banyak Pak Taufik. Mohon izin.
Ya, terima kasih Bu Irli sekali lagi.
Terima kasih.
So it is a very catching presentation. I think how to split our mark in Indonesia, especially for Bajo tribe. And we also know from your presentation that family is the first education for the kids, right? Okay, then. So thank you very much for the insight. Next, I will invite Ibu Dias Marta Khairunisa. Are you here, Ibu Dias? Ibu Dias tadi ada. Oh ya, ini sudah ada.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Okay, Bu Dias, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, so you must start your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, Ma'am and Sir. Thank you for the opportunity that giving to me. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Dias Marta Khairunisa. I'm a student from Accounting Department Universitas PGRI Madiun. Today I will present the result of my paper on Islamic with the title, The Effect of Companies ROA and Size on Zakat in Sharia Commercial Banks. Next. Okay, today I will present several things related to the paper that I made, including table of content. Number 1, problem background. Number 2, research question. Number 3, research methodology. Number 4, analysis and discussion. And number 5, conclusion and suggestion. Next. The first, I will discuss about the background of the problem. In Indonesia, a joint research by the National Amil Zakat Agency with various institutions state that the potential for zakat in 2020 reached 327.6 trillion Indonesian rupiah. However, the realization has only reached 71.4 trillion Indonesian rupiah, or around 21.7%. The biggest zakat potential in 2020 is corporate zakat of 144.5 trillion Indonesian rupiah, income and service zakat of 139.7 trillion Indonesian rupiah, money zakat of 58.76 trillion Indonesian rupiah, agricultural zakat 90.79 trillion Indonesian rupiah, and livestock zakat 9.52 trillion Indonesian rupiah. Zakat during the COVID-19 pandemic gave a very light domino effect on human life from the social, economic, and cultural health crisis. Next. Muzaki National Amil Zakat Agency decreased by 48.4%. The Vice President Ma'aruf Amin said that the 2020 National Coordination Meeting recommendations still need to be implemented in 2021, such as zakat distribution, replication of practice in zakat collection, development of innovation, and digitalization of zakat, as well as finance in the company's business activities. Next. One of the things that must be improved in managing zakat include transparency and targeting accuracy in the distribution of zakat to mustahik. That is, the quality of research must be improved in managing zakat, which contributes to regarding the level of property in Indonesia, so that reach one factor that reach interest zakat and increase muzaki is important to do because zakat in economic growth. Another positive impact is to give clarity. Zakat can also affect real GDP or gross domestic income growth, which means that if every zakat collection pound increase, it will unlock economic growth. Next. Factors that affect of zakat including number one, profitability. The profitability ratio use return on asset or ROA because ROA focuses on the company's ability to obtain company operating earning. Number two, company size. Company size can be used for the company operating if the company has large total asset. The company's implication on zakat as well will cause the orientation toward zakat also affect the company's performance. Next. Number two, research question. Based on the above background, this research include as well. Number one, does return asset ROA affect the company's zakat? And number two, does the size of the company affect the company's zakat? Next. Number three, research methodology. Place and time. Islamic Commercial Bank Commission in 2014 to 2020 financial report data were obtained for the www.idx.co.id website and the official website of each company. Population sample sampling technique. The population used in this study is Islamic Commercial Bank in Indonesia, which are listed on the Indonesia Stock Exchange. The sample used in the study common to 13 Islamic Commercial Bank companies. The department of the sample in this study was carried out use the proposed sampling method. Next. Number four, analysis and discussion. The study is multiple linear regression analysis and t-test to test whether ROA and company size have an effect on zakat, and the sigma result also ROA and company size below 0.05, meaning that ROA and company size have an effect on zakat. Next. And the last, conclusion and suggestion. Number one, conclusion, based on secondary data from the annual financial statement of Islamic commercial banks in Indonesia during 2014 to 2020 by test use descriptive statistical analysis and hypothesis testing, use multiple linear regression analysis and t-test. To conclusion were obtained. First, ROA has a positive effect on corporate zakat. And number two, company size has a positive effect on company zakat. And last suggestion, future research is expected to be able to use different research period and add research sample or can add variable that can affect zakat so that they can generalize the research. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Ibu Dias Marta Hairunisa, for your clear explanation about the company's ROA and zakah. And zakah, yeah. Okay, so for the next turn, I would like to back to Bapak Dr. Nurois. I'll invite again Mr. Nurois. Okay, are you there? Okay. We hope that the connection is already normal. Yeah.
Okay, inshallah.
So you can share your screen now and start your presentation, please.
Okay, I'm sorry about the disruption of my connection. Back to my title is debating the science of jurisprudence, studying jurisprudence from the philosophy of science perspective. As introduction, as we know, philosophy and science are two interrelated words that both substantially and historically because the birth of science is inseparable from the role of philosophy. On the other hand, the development of science is also strengthens the existence of philosophy. According to Herman Suwardi, we can begin to understand science with the philosophy of science as the basic foundation of science in the form of empirical science. In the philosophy of science, science divided into three areas, namely ontology, epistemology, and axiology. And ontology is theory of science about existence, about the nature. Ontology is not based on the real world, but it's based on solely on logic. Epistemology, as we know, called theory of knowledge, is a branch philosophy of detail which deals with the nature and scope of knowledge, its presumption, its foundation, and accountability for statement about the knowledge process. The second is, the last is axiology. As we know, is theory of value. It's about the useful of science. Jurisprudence or legal science, it is development. It's always debate about the scientific status. Since the 19th centuries, there have been a few that doubt the scientific position of legal science. G.H. von Kitzmann in 1848, in a speech entitled "De Werkkunst der Jurisprudence als Wetenschap," or in English we call the worthless of law as a science. It states that the jurisprudence or legal science is not a science, it's just a knowledge of statute or act. But to answer the question is this jurisprudence a science or not? Is regarding the scientific status. It's not only answered through the statement. However, it must study it with a strong and clearly analytical foundation from the scientific aspect. So it's the basic of my article research question is, how is the scientific status of jurisprudence or legal science if studied from perspective of the philosophy of science through the ontological, epistemological, and axiological studies? Method I use for my article is library research by looking the point of view of philosophy of science as Herman Suwardi opinion that is understanding science with the looking at the side of ontology, axiology, and epistemology. Jurisprudence or legal science is divided into formal and empirical science. Based of its substance from science referred to knowledge that is not based on experience or empirical. At the same time, empirical science aims to obtain factual knowledge about actual reality which come from empirical or experience. In a formal, science refers to knowledge that is not based on experience or empirical. But in empirical, science belongs to the theoretical science of group, which is intended to gain knowledge only. And the partner of theoretical science is a practical science with the studies, the application of the science itself as its object. From the point of view epistemology, when we view from this perspective, law is an object of jurisprudence, as a distinct or dualistic meaning. On the other hand, the law is defined as a norm, namely statement with the substance of necessity, or in the Greek language called solon, with the inclusion of sanction as a logical consequences of not complying with this action. On the other hand, the law is also interpreted as a nomos, namely statement regarding to existence or absence of the certain behavior consistency in a factual collective life. In everyday language, the law can be interpreted with the concept of normative as a rule, and on the other hand is a factual concept of the order. In the axiology perspective, jurisprudence or legal study is a perspective science with the substance of jurisprudence and legal science. Jurisprudence and legal science studies is purpose of the law, value, justice, and validity in legal rule, legal concept, and legal norm. Science establishes standard and procedure provision in the implementing of rule of law and applied science. Mohtar Kusuma Atmaja said, law is a tool to maintain order in a society with a conservative nature, namely maintaining and defending what has been achieved. This is law as we call something that move the development of the country, also known the law as a development. Is Mohtar Kusuma Atmaja theory. As a conclusion, doubt about science law began to the doubt of the methodology in the science of law. It is true that science of law has a distinctive methodology and a different method from the other science. However, by studying the philosophy of science, doubt about the science of jurisprudence or legal science can be eliminated, and it can be concluded that jurisprudence or legal science is included in a part of the science. There's no doubt. But the question is it a law is a theoretical science or practical science? I think that's enough. I would like to add a review from here. Okay, thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bu Sardian. Oke, Bu Sardian sepertinya lagi ini ya. Tidak, sepertinya jaringannya juga kurang ini. Kita langsung saja ya. Kita langsung saja kepada Bapak Muhammad Rusdi. Ada ya Pak Muhammad Rusdi ya?
Ya, hadir.
Oke. Ya, baik Pak. Saya share screen-nya dulu Pak.
Ya. Let me share screen.
Baik, silakan Pak Muhammad Rusdi. Waktu dan tempatnya sama ya, 10 menit.
Okay.
Oh ya, oke. Bu Sardian.
Sudah dipersilakan ya. This is my brother Muhammad Rusdi from Yayan Bone. Halo Pak Rusdi.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for the time given to me in this time to present paper entitled 20 years of Arabic learning in the scientific traditions of UIN Alauddin Makassar, anthropolinguistic perspective from 2002 to 2022. Basically, I'm interested to develop this title because I was an Arabic lecturer at UIN Alauddin Makassar before I moved to IAIN Bone in 2010. Maybe we can move to the next slide. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah. In this title, basically there are two words, yeah, that we can say that it is the key words, yeah. First, Arabic learning, and the second one, scientific traditions. Because I'm not sure that, yeah, Arabic learning and scientific tradition are two aspects that we can be separated each other. Yeah, according to the historical record in Arabic learning at UIN Alauddin Makassar from 2002 to 2021, yeah, there are some foreign language learning programs, yeah, like the Foreign Language Intensification Program or FIBA, the Imani Enlightenment and the Life Skills Program or PP, the Character Building Program, CBP, and the currently returning to the intensification of foreign languages, FIBA, with the orientation towards strengthening the test of Arabic as a foreign language or TOEFL. Yeah. Basically, to the implementation of the Arabic learning programs, we can find that each program has characteristic and orientation in their implementation. And especially in line with the scientific tradition, yeah, I find that a dynamic scientific tradition at UIN Alauddin Makassar. Because if we would like to identify to some universities in Indonesia like UIN Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang, yeah, from the first until now, it is only has one scientific tradition that they call scientific tree, as well as we can find in UIN Sunan Kalijaga. It has one scientific tradition, namely Spider Net scientific tradition. But at UIN Alauddin Makassar, if you would like to identify from 2001 until 2022, we can find some scientific traditions that have been developed, like the Rabbani campus, yeah, during the Abdul Muin Salim leadership, scientific evergreen during the leadership of Asar Arsyad, the home of civilization during the leadership of Kadir Gasing, and as well as the scientific trend during the leadership of Hamdan Juhanis. So based on this fact, we can find that at Alauddin Makassar there is dynamic, yeah, scientific tradition that show that the learning paradigm at the campus move well. Okay, maybe we can move to the next slide. Okay, okay. Now, to identify the Arabic learning in the scientific tradition, we would like to identify them as well as the anthropo-linguistic perspective. And of course, there are three parameters that we use, like language aspect in the form of learning Arabic, which includes the study of paralinguistic, proxemic, and kinetic text and context. Culture aspect in the form of scientific traditions, which includes studies of cultural context and context of material element. And the third parameter, namely other aspect of human life in the study of constructive relation between Arabic learning and scientific tradition that cover social context, situation, and ideologies. And if you like to see the implementation of Arabic learning at UIN Al Makassar, firstly, we can find at the foreign language learning intensification program, yeah, in the spectrum of the Rabbani campus as the leadership of Abdul Muin Salim as director of UIN Al Makassar. At the time, the orientation of learning Arabic, namely, how could the students be able to read some references written in Arabic? Yeah. So at the time, the book that were used, namely Al-Arabiya Al-Muyassara, as composed by our teacher Mustafa Nuri. At the time, the learning Arabic, yeah, proposed to the students by focusing to the syntaxis aspect of Arabic learning. But during the leadership of Asar Arsyad, yeah, when he developed what we call the Imani Enlightenment and the Life Skill Program, or PIKI, at the time he developed a scientific tradition, what he called the scientific evergreen, yeah, cemara ilmu. So at the time, he used language as the tool for communication. So during the time, we can find that the teaching Arabic, yeah, at the time is orientation to use the book that he's composed, yeah, where the book, yeah, try to introduce about the Arabic vocabulary from nouns and verbs, yeah. And then at the learning process, the lecturer tried to compose the vocabulary into word, yeah, that are unique one by one, what we call as al-asalib al-lugawiyya al-arabiyya. Ya, fi hadhihi at-tariqa qad hawala al-muta'allim li taqwiyati ta'lim al-lugha al-arabiyya mathalan li i'ta'i al-amr lil akharin, ya, fi ba'd al-ahyani qala al-ustaz uktub ar-risalah, ya, uktub ar-risalah. Mathalan hina mana muqaddim aswal li syakhsin, ya, indana al-qurb, ya, mathalan fil umar. ولكن حينما نريد أن نقدم السؤال للشخص الذي يمتلك المواقف أعلى منا في بعض الأحيان نحن نقدم السؤال مثلا هل يجوز لك أن تكتب الرسالة. We cannot deliver direct instruction to the person that has higher position than us. But in the other time they only use it like لا تجعل أو لا تعجل أوقاتك لكتابة الرسالة. Yeah. So we can find that there is a dynamic way that's applied in this program. Meanwhile, to the next program, especially to the leadership of Kadir Gasing and Musafir Pababari, they deliver a scientific tradition, what they call the House of Civilization or Rumah Peradaban. So in this learning process, especially for Arabic language, we find that there is a philosophy that they develop, like learn language, learn about language, and learn through language. Especially to the third phase, namely learn through language. Yeah, the students not just learn a language like in phonetic aspect, syntaxic aspect, morphological aspect, or semantic aspect, but they learn some values like unity, humanity, justice, friendship, and so forth. So at the time, learning Arabic was oriented to transform the noble values to the students. And the next, we move to the leadership of Hamdan Jumanis when he developed a scientific tradition, what he called as a scientific train. Yeah, at the time he developed the same program as the previous, like the foreign language learning intensification program, but there is a difference in the implementation of program where the previous focus on capability to identify the Arabic references to support the students' educational background, but in Hamdan Jumanis leadership, there is an addition, beside to support the students to read some reference in line with their educational background. They also were oriented to develop the grade, especially in line with what we call a test of Arabic language as a foreign language or TOEFL. So I think that there is an anthropological perspective to see the transformation of a scientific tradition of UIN Audin Makassar, like from the Rabbani campus, the scientific evergreen, the house of civilization, and the scientific of trend. Because the scientific of trend shows there's something moving. So I believe that UI and also with the scientific trend will get more and more better than before. I think that's all the presentation for me. Syukran kasih lahu ihtimamikum wa tubul afwa minkum hina ma indi khotiyala ma qultulakum. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Ustaz Rusdi from Yayan Bone. Okay, so from Bapak Muhammad Rusdi, we have the history of Arabic learning in UIN, giving us a clear explanation about this, Ustaz Rusdi. Okay, for the next turn, I would like to invite Iftahul Digariski.
Okay.
Are you here? Okay. So to